Welcome to another peaceful journey through ancient Greece, where even the mightiest heroes moved with the unhurried pace of afternoon shadows. Tonight we follow the gentle footsteps of Theseus as he wanders through sun-warmed olive groves and marble corridors that echo with whispers of old stories. Let the Mediterranean breeze carry you into dreams where labyrinthine passages wind like the softest lullabies, and where even Minotaurs pause for drowsy afternoon naps. Close your eyes and drift with us to shores where waves lap against ancient stones with the rhythm of peaceful breathing, and legends unfold as slowly as honey dripping from a wooden spoon. In the kingdom of Athens, where olive trees cast long shadows across marble courtyards and the Aegean Sea whispered constantly against weathered cliffs, there lived a king whose heart carried the weight of profound loneliness. King Aegeus ruled his people with wisdom and kindness, yet his palace halls echoed with an emptiness that no amount of gold or glory could fill. The servants moved quietly through chambers adorned with the finest tapestries, their sandaled feet making soft sounds against polished stone floors. But even their gentle presence could not ease the ache in the king's chest. Each evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and amber, Aegeus would climb the steps to his highest tower and gaze out across the wine, dark waters that stretched endlessly toward distant horizons. The seabirds called softly to each other as they settled for the night, their voices joining the eternal murmur of waves against the shore. The king's fingers would trace the cool marble of the tower's edge as he watched fishing boats return with their evening catch, their white sails barely stirring in the gentle breeze. These simple vessels carried families home to warm hearths and children's laughter, sounds that seemed to drift up from the harbour like fragrant smoke from evening cooking fires. The royal advisors spoke often of treaties and trade, of grain stores and golden treasures, but their voices seemed to come from very far away when Aegeus thought of his deepest wish. In the quietest hours before dawn, when even the palace cats had found comfortable corners for sleep, the king would walk slowly through gardens where night, blooming jasmine released its sweet perfume into the still air. He would pause beside fountains where water fell in steady, soothing patterns, creating ripples that caught the starlight like scattered diamonds. The oracle at Delphi had spoken in riddles wrapped in mysteries, her words floating through the sacred chamber like incense smoke. Her prophecy drifted through the king's dreams like half-remembered music, speaking of journeys and choices, of sons who would come like spring rain after long drought. But understanding prophecies required patience, and Aegeus had learned that the gods preferred their gifts to arrive wrapped in time's own gentle unfolding, like flowers that bloom only when the season whispers their secret names. Years drifted by like clouds across the peaceful Athenian sky, and King Aegeus found himself drawn to travel beyond his marble halls. The road to Troezen wound through hillsides dotted with wild herbs that released their fragrance under the warm wheels of his bronze chariot. Dust motes danced lazily in the afternoon light as his horses moved at an unhurried pace, their hooves creating a gentle rhythm against the well-worn stones. The journey felt more like a meditation than travel, each bend in the road revealing new groves of ancient trees whose branches swayed with the wisdom of centuries. In Troezen, King Theseus welcomed his royal guest with wine that tasted of summer afternoons and honey cakes that melted on the tongue like sweet memories. The old king's daughter, Aethra, moved through the palace gardens with the grace of morning mist, her voice carrying the soft cadence of someone who understood the language of growing things. When she spoke, even the olive trees seemed to lean closer, their leaves rustling approval in the gentle evening breeze. Time seemed to slow in her presence, as if the very air had been blessed with the power to stretch moments into small eternities. The gods work in mysterious ways, weaving love and fate together, like threads in an invisible tapestry, under stars that sparkled like scattered pearls against velvet darkness. Aegeus and Aethra walked through moonlit courtyards where night-blooming Sirius opened their pale petals to drink the silver light. Their whispered conversations blended with the soft murmur of fountains and the distant sound of waves against the distant shore. By autumn, when the first leaves began their lazy drift toward earth, Aethra carried within her the answer to years of royal longing. Before departing for Athens, King Aegeus led Aethra to a place where ancient stones lay scattered like sleeping giants across a hillside meadow. With great effort, he moved aside a boulder that seemed to have rested there since the world's beginning, revealing a hollow beneath that held treasures wrapped in oiled cloth. A sword gleamed softly in the dappled sunlight, its bronze blade inscribed with symbols that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Beside it lay sandals of supple leather, crafted by master artisans, whose skills had been passed down through generations of careful hands. The king's voice was gentle as summer rain when he explained his purpose to Aethra, whose hand rested protectively over her growing belly. Should their child be a son, and should he possess the strength to move this mighty stone, these gifts would serve as proof of his royal heritage. The boulder settled back into place with a sound like distant thunder, and wild flowers already began to grow around its base, as if nature herself conspired to keep the secret safe until its proper time arrived. 16 summers had painted the hillsides of Troezen with their gentle warmth. When young Theseus first approached the mysterious stone, his mother had shown him countless times in their evening walks. His limbs had grown strong from swimming in quiet coves, where dolphins sometimes played just beyond the breakers, and his hands bore the comfortable calluses of one who worked alongside craftsmen and farmers rather than merely commanding them. The morning air carried the scent of wild thyme and sea salt as he knelt beside the boulder, running his fingers along its weathered surface where tiny lizards sunned themselves in the early light. Aethra watched from a distance, her heart beating with the slow rhythm of anticipation as her son pressed his shoulder against the ancient stone. For a moment, nothing happened except the gentle song of cicadas in the olive groves and the distant call of fishing boats heading out to sea. Then, with a grinding sound like the earth itself sighing, the massive rock began to shift. Inch by careful inch, it rolled aside to reveal the hollow beneath, where bronze and leather gleamed with the patience of buried treasure waiting for its destined hour. The sword felt perfectly balanced in Theseus's young hands, its weight neither too heavy nor too light, as if it had been forged specifically for his grip. The sandals slipped onto his feet with the comfort of familiar friends, their leather supple, despite years of waiting. As his mother told him the story of his father's visit, her voice soft as evening prayers, Theseus felt something settle into place within his heart. The road to Athens stretched before him, like an invitation written in dust and starlight, winding through countryside where adventures waited as patiently as shepherds tending their flocks. Rather than sailing across waters that sparkled like hammered silver under the Mediterranean sun, Theseus chose the longer path that curved along coastlines and through mountain passes where eagles circled on thermals rising from sun-warmed rocks. His mother had packed provisions that would sustain him for many days. Bread that stayed fresh wrapped in clean linen, cheese that improved with age, and wine mixed with enough water to quench thirst without clouding judgment. Each step carried him further from the only home he had ever known, yet somehow closer to a destiny that felt as natural as breathing. The first evening found him camping beside a stream, where moonlight turned the flowing water into liquid silver. As he built a small fire from driftwood and dried grass, The flames danced with the hypnotic rhythm of waves against distant shores. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called softly to its mate, and small creatures rustled through undergrowth on their own mysterious errands. Wrapped in his travelling cloak, with his father's sword beside him, and the stars wheeling slowly overhead, Theseus drifted into dreams where roads stretched on forever, and every horizon promised new wonders waiting just beyond the next gentle hill. The coastal road meandered through groves where ancient pine trees released their resinous perfume into the warm morning air, and Theseus walked with the unhurried pace of someone who understood that journeys were meant to be savoured rather than rushed. Butterflies danced among wildflowers that had claimed the roadside as their own kingdom, their wings catching sunlight like fragments of stained glass windows. The sound of his sandals against worn stones created a gentle rhythm that seemed to harmonize with the distant murmur of waves and the soft whisper of wind through olive branches. As the sun reached its drowsy afternoon height, painting everything in golden honey light, Theseus encountered a figure seated comfortably in the shade of a massive oak tree. Periphetes had chosen his resting spot well, where cool shadows provided respite from the day's warmth, and a small spring bubbled up from between moss-covered rocks to form a clear pool perfect for drinking. The man's famous bronze club lay beside him like a faithful dog, its surface worn smooth by countless hands and polished to a dull gleam that caught the dappled light filtering through leaves above. The bandit, his reputation had spread through villages like morning mist, but seeing him in person revealed a different sort of figure than the fierce warrior of travellers' tales. His movements possessed the deliberate slowness of someone who had learned that haste led to mistakes, and his eyes held the patient gleam of a cat watching birds from a sunny windowsill. When he spoke, his voice carried the drowsy cadence of afternoon conversation between old friends, as if violence were merely another form of leisurely entertainment to pass the time. Their conversation unfolded with the gentle pace of honey dripping from a wooden spoon, each exchange building slowly toward an inevitable conclusion that both participants seemed to understand without urgency. Periphetes explained his philosophy with the comfortable tone of someone discussing the weather, how strength should be tested like wine should be tasted. Slowly and with proper appreciation, the bronze club felt surprisingly heavy when Theseus lifted it, its weight distributed in a way that spoke of master craftsmanship and generations of use by those who understood the art of patient combat. The contest that followed moved with the dreamlike quality of underwater dancing, each motion deliberate and flowing into the next like movements in a meditation. When Periphetes finally lay down for his eternal rest beneath the oak tree's protective shade, his face wore the peaceful expression of someone settling in for a comfortable afternoon nap. Theseus arranged the bronze club beside the sleeping bandit like a pillow, then continued on his way as shadows began to lengthen and evening approached with its promise of cool breezes and cricket songs. The road ahead curved gently toward distant hills where cooking fires were beginning to twinkle like earthbound stars, and somewhere a shepherd was calling his flock home with a voice that echoed softly across the peaceful countryside. 2 days of walking brought Theseus to a region where towering pine trees grew so thick their canopy filtered sunlight into cathedral, like beams that illuminated forest floors carpeted with fallen needles. The air carried the clean scent of resin and the faint sweetness of wild berries ripening in hidden clearings where deer came to drink from streams that bubbled over smooth stones. Birds called to each other in voices that seemed designed for echoing through green halls, and somewhere in the distance a woodpecker maintained its patient rhythm against bark that had weathered countless seasons. In a meadow where the trees opened like curtains revealing a stage, Theseus discovered Cinis engaged in his peculiar afternoon routine. The famous pine, Bender had chosen two magnificent trees whose trunks rose straight and true toward the sky, their branches swaying in the gentle breeze with the grace of dancers moving to music only they could hear. His movements possessed the methodical quality of a craftsman perfecting his art, each motion flowing into the next with the unhurried precision of someone who had transformed violence into a form of meditation. Cinis worked with the concentration of a potter shaping clay, his massive hands finding purchase on bark that had been worn smooth by repetition. The pine trees bent toward each other with the slow reluctance of sleeping giants being coaxed from dreams, their branches creating patterns against the sky that shifted like shadows moving across sundials. When he paused to wipe perspiration from his brow, his breathing maintained the steady rhythm of ocean waves, and his smile held the contentment of someone engaged in work that brought deep satisfaction. The conversation between the two men unfolded with the unhurried pace of afternoon tea, each question and answer given time to settle like sediment in still water. Cinis explained his philosophy with the patient tone of a teacher, sharing wisdom with a promising student, how flexibility and strength must work together like partners in a dance that had been choreographed by forces older than memory. The pine trees themselves seemed to participate in the discussion, their whispered conversations adding counterpoint to human voices that rose and fell with the natural rhythm of breathing. When Theseus suggested they test their respective skills, the proposal seemed as natural as suggesting a swim on a warm day or a nap in comfortable shade. The contest that followed moved with the dreamlike quality of clouds drifting across summer skies, each participant taking turns bending the patient pines while the other watched with the appreciative attention of someone observing a master craftsman at work. Eventually, Cinis found himself launched into the afternoon sky, like a seed carried on warm updrafts, his trajectory carrying him beyond the forest canopy, where he settled gently among branches that welcomed him like an old friend coming home. Theseus continued on his way, as evening painted the western sky in shades of rose and gold, the pine trees swaying behind him in a breeze that carried the promise of cool nights and peaceful dreams beneath star-scattered darkness. The road descended through terraced hillsides where grapevines heavy with autumn fruit created patterns of shadow and sunlight that danced across weathered stone walls. Theseus walked with the contented pace of someone who had learned to appreciate the simple pleasure of placing one foot before the other, his mind drifting like morning mist as he observed the countryside's gentle transition from wild forest to cultivated farmland. Olive groves stretched in neat rows across rolling hills, their silver-green leaves catching afternoon light like thousands of tiny mirrors reflecting the peaceful sky above. As he approached the village of Crommyon, the young hero noticed something peculiar about the quality of silence that hung over the settlement like a comfortable blanket. No sounds of daily life drifted from the houses that lined cobblestone streets. No voices calling greetings or children playing games in shaded courtyards. Instead, the entire village seemed wrapped in the drowsy quiet of a summer afternoon, when everyone had chosen to rest in cool shadows until the day's heat began to fade into evening's gentle embrace. Beyond the village proper, where cultivated fields gave way to wilder growth, Theseus discovered the source of Crommyon's reputation for harboring dangerous creatures. In a garden that had clearly once been tended with loving care, now grown wonderfully wild with flowering vines and fruit trees heavy with ripening bounty, a magnificent sow had established her own private paradise. The creature moved through her domain with the unhurried dignity of a queen surveying beloved lands, pausing occasionally to sample fallen apples or to scratch her considerable bulk against tree trunks, worn smooth by years of such attention. Rather than the fierce monster described in travellers' tales, this so possessed an almost philosophical air as she went about her daily routine of gardening in her own peculiar fashion. She had cultivated certain areas by turning soil with systematic precision, creating beds where wildflowers bloomed in chaotic profusion, alongside vegetables that had seeded themselves according to nature's own mysterious design. Her movements suggested not malevolence, but rather the deep contentment of a creature who had found her perfect place in the world, and intended to defend it with the gentle stubbornness of someone protecting a beloved afternoon nap. The conversation between hero and sow unfolded without words, conducted instead through the ancient language of mutual respect and careful observation. Theseus approached with the slow movements of someone visiting a friend's garden, taking time to admire the sow's horticultural achievements and the way morning glory vines had wound themselves around abandoned farming tools to create living sculptures. When their philosophical differences finally required resolution, the encounter possessed all the drowsy inevitability of autumn leaves falling to earth, each movement flowing naturally into the next, until the sow settled into eternal rest beneath her favorite apple tree. The village of Crommyon gradually awakened from its enchanted silence as Theseus continued on his journey, leaving behind a garden that would bloom more beautifully than ever in seasons yet to come. The coastal path climbed steadily through scrubland, where wild herbs released their fragrant oils under the warm pressure of Theseus's sandals, and the Mediterranean stretched endlessly toward horizons that shimmered like silk in the afternoon heat. Seabirds rode the thermal currents rising from sun-warmed cliffs, their cries blending with the eternal conversation between waves and weathered stone far below. The air carried salt and the green scent of vegetation that had learned to thrive in rocky soil, creating a perfume that spoke of ancient patience and the slow work of wind and water shaping the world according to their own mysterious designs. Where the path narrowed to wind along precipitous ledges, Theseus encountered Sciron engaged in his daily routine of toll collection with all the methodical precision of a customs official who had elevated bureaucracy to an art form. The bandit had arranged his workspace with careful attention to comfort, positioning a wooden stool in the optimal spot for both shade and scenic views of the azure waters below. His collection of traveller contributions sat neatly organized in pottery vessels, each coin and trinket sorted according to some system that clearly made perfect sense to its creator. The famous foot-washing ceremony that Sciron required of all passers-by had evolved over years of practice into something resembling a religious ritual performed with the solemnity of temple priests tending sacred flames. A bronze basin filled with seawater caught the light like liquid gold, while soft towels woven from the finest linen waited in neat stacks beside clay jars containing oils perfumed with lavender and rosemary. When Sciron explained his requirements, his voice carried the patient tone of someone who had delivered the same speech countless times and had learned to appreciate its rhythmic qualities. The foot-washing proceeded with the unhurried pace of a meditation, each gesture flowing into the next with practiced grace, as warm water and scented oils worked their soothing magic on feet that had carried Theseus across many miles of dusty roads. Sciron's hands moved with the skilled touch of someone who understood the art of hospitality, even if his motivations remained somewhat unconventional. The rhythmic sound of waves against rocks far below provided musical accompaniment to the ceremony, while seabirds called to each other in voices that seemed to approve of this ancient ritual being performed high above their domain. When the time came for Sciron's traditional finale, the moment unfolded with the dreamlike quality of watching clouds change shape in slow motion. The bandit's surprised expression suggested that being launched into the air had never been part of his carefully planned routine, though he adapted to this new experience with the philosophical acceptance of someone discovering an unexpected plot twist in a familiar story. His descent toward the welcoming waves below possessed all the graceful inevitability of autumn leaves spiraling toward earth, while far below the sea creatures prepared to welcome their latest visitor with the hospitality that ancient waters had always shown to those who came calling. Theseus gathered the scattered toll collections and redistributed them among wild flowers that grew in cliffside crevices, creating small treasures for future travelers to discover like gifts left by generous spirits of the road. The inland path wound through countryside, where shepherd boys dozed in patches of shade while their flocks grazed peacefully. On hillsides dotted with wild sage and thyme that released their perfume each time a warm breeze stirred the afternoon air. Ancient stone walls marked boundaries that had been respected for generations, their weathered surfaces providing comfortable perches for lizards who sunned themselves with the contented stillness of creatures who understood the value of perfect moments. Somewhere in the distance, a farmer was singing an old song while he worked, his voice carrying across fields, where grain ripened under skies the color of forget me nots, in Eleusis, where sacred mysteries were whispered among initiates who moved through temple courtyards with the reverent steps of those who carried profound secrets. Theseus discovered Circean maintaining his wrestling ground with the dedicated attention of a gardener tending prize roses. The famous grappler had created an outdoor gymnasium that would have made professional athletes weep with envy, complete with sand, raked to perfect smoothness and boundary stones, positioned according to principles of geometry that elevated sport to the level of sacred art. The wrestling mat itself represented years of careful preparation, its surface consisting of sand mixed with precisely the right amount of oil to create optimal conditions for athletic competition. Circean moved across this prepared ground with the fluid grace of a dancer rehearsing choreography, his warm-up routine consisting of stretches and breathing exercises that suggested someone who approached physical contest as a form of moving meditation. When he spotted Theseus approaching, his smile carried the genuine pleasure of a master craftsman discovering someone who might truly appreciate his work. Their preliminary conversation unfolded with the leisurely pace of wine tasting, each participant taking time to assess the other's credentials and philosophy regarding the noble art of wrestling. Circean explained his techniques with the patient enthusiasm of a teacher sharing knowledge with a promising student, demonstrating holds and throws with movements so slow and precise they resembled choreographed sequences from temple dances. The afternoon sun painted everything in golden light that transformed their practice session into something that belonged in pottery paintings depicting heroic competitions among gods and mortals. The actual wrestling match proceeded with the dreamlike quality of underwater ballet, each grappler responding to the other's movements with the flowing precision of partners who had rehearsed their dance for years. They circled each other like planets following orbital patterns written in starlight, occasionally coming together in brief embraces that tested strength and technique before separating again to continue their elegant circling. When Circean finally found himself lifted high above the wrestling ground, his expression suggested less surprise than philosophical curiosity about this unexpected variation in familiar choreography. His landing created patterns in the carefully prepared sand that resembled abstract art, while overhead the first evening stars appeared in skies that deepened from blue to purple like silk dyed in celestial workshops. Theseus helped smooth the wrestling ground back to perfection before continuing on his way, leaving behind a space that would welcome future athletes with sand as soft as powder and evening breezes that whispered encouragement to all who came seeking tests of strength and skill. The final stretch of road to Athens meandered through countryside, where evening shadows grew long and purple, and the first cooking fires of distant farmhouses began to twinkle like earthbound stars scattered across rolling hills. Theseus walked with the satisfied pace of someone whose journey was nearing its destined conclusion, his thoughts drifting like smoke from those welcoming hearths toward the father he had never met and the city that awaited beyond the next range of gentle mountains. Night, blooming jasmine released its sweet perfume into air that carried the promise of cool rest after long days of travel, while somewhere in the gathering darkness an owl called softly to its mate, with a voice that spoke of ancient wisdom and patient hunting. Procrustes had established his famous inn at the perfect location for weary travelers, where the road curved around a grove of plane trees whose broad leaves created natural pavilions of shade during hot afternoons and shelter from unexpected rain showers. The innkeeper moved through his establishment with the precise attention to detail of someone who had elevated hospitality to the level of sacred art, checking and rechecking every element that contributed to his guests' comfort. Lanterns filled with the finest olive oil cast warm golden light across courtyards, paved with smooth stones, while the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread drifted from kitchens where skilled cooks worked their quiet magic. The famous bed that formed the centerpiece of Procrustes' hospitality represented years of careful research into the science of perfect rest, its dimensions calculated according to principles of proportion that would have impressed mathematicians and philosophers alike. The mattress consisted of wool so fine it seemed to float like captured clouds, while linen sheets woven from flax grown in the most fertile fields created surfaces smoother than still water reflecting moonlight. Pillows stuffed with down from geese, who had lived lives of luxury in protected sanctuaries, provided support that adjusted itself to each sleeper's individual needs with the responsive sensitivity of living creatures. When Procrustes explained his commitment to ensuring that every guest fit his accommodations with absolute precision, his voice carried the passionate intensity of an artist, describing years spent perfecting a masterpiece. He demonstrated his adjustment techniques with movements that possessed the flowing grace of a master sculptor working marble into ideal forms, each gesture calculated to achieve harmony between sleeper and sleeping space. The tools of his trade lay arranged with surgical precision on nearby tables, their bronze and iron surfaces polished to mirror brightness and sharpened to edges that could divide single hairs without disturbing their neighbors. The evening's accommodation arrangement proceeded with the methodical precision of a temple ritual, though the specific details unfolded in ways that surprised even Procrustes himself. When dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, the innkeeper had discovered new and unexpected dimensions to his own perfectly measured bed, while Theseus continued toward Athens with the peaceful satisfaction of someone who had solved an ancient puzzle through the simple application of common sense. Behind him, the inn settled into a comfortable silence where future travelers would find beds that somehow managed to fit everyone perfectly, no matter their individual measurements or particular requirements for restful sleep. Jars filled with powdered minerals sparkled like captured starlight on shelves, carved from wood that had grown in sacred groves, while bundles of dried herbs hung from rafters in arrangements that created their own subtle harmonies of scent and color. When she moved among these treasures, her fingers seemed to know exactly which combination would produce the desired effect, as if the plants themselves whispered their secrets to someone who had learned their ancient language. The palace had welcomed Medea's presence with the grateful acceptance of those who recognized genuine skill, and King Aegeus consulted her wisdom in matters that required more than conventional royal counsel could provide. Her chambers occupied a wing where morning light revealed workbenches arranged with the precise order of someone who approached her craft with the reverence of a temple priestess tending sacred flames. The sound of grinding mortars and the gentle bubbling of various preparations created a constant background music that spoke of transformation happening in small, careful increments, according to recipes that had been refined through generations of practice. When young Theseus arrived at the palace gates, claiming kinship with the king, Medea received this news with the thoughtful attention of someone who understood that unexpected developments often required special consideration. Her cauldron simmered with preparations that could serve many purposes, their effects depending entirely upon the wisdom and intention of those who administered them. The bronze spoon in her hand moved through thick liquid with hypnotic regularity, creating patterns that seemed to mirror the swirling thoughts of someone weighing complex possibilities against equally complex consequences. The evening meal that would welcome the stranger proceeded according to customs that honored both hospitality and prudence, with dishes arranged in traditional patterns that pleased both eye and palate. Medea added her own contributions to the feast with the careful attention of someone who understood that nourishment could take many forms, her special preparations blending seamlessly with conventional offerings in ways that required considerable skill to achieve. As servants lit oil lamps that would illuminate the dining chamber with warm golden light, the sorceress made final adjustments to refreshments that would ensure the evening's revelations unfolded according to destiny's own mysterious preferences for timing and circumstance. The royal dining chamber glowed with the soft radiance of oil lamps, whose flames danced like captured spirits celebrating the approach of momentous occasions, while servants arranged couches and tables with the reverent precision of those preparing sacred spaces for divine visitation. King Aegeus entered these familiar surroundings with steps that carried the weight of years spent hoping for this exact moment, though he moved with the careful composure of someone who had learned not to let anticipation overwhelm the delicate protocols that governed royal hospitality. The evening air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of night, blooming jasmine, and the distant sound of fountains, whose waters had witnessed countless palace gatherings throughout the generations. Theseus reclined on cushions that had been woven by master craftsmen whose skills transformed simple wool into surfaces softer than morning clouds, while platters of roasted meat and honey cakes created a feast that honored both tradition and abundance. The young hero's movements possessed the natural grace of someone who belonged in these surroundings, without quite understanding why, his gestures unconsciously echoing patterns that had been repeated by countless generations of royal blood. When he reached for his cup, the bronze sword at his side caught lamplight in ways that made King Aegeus pause mid-sentence, recognition dawning like sunrise over familiar landscapes that had been hidden by darkness. The conversation that had flowed with the gentle rhythm of evening breezes suddenly acquired the quality of held breath, as if the very air understood that destiny was adjusting its mechanisms to accommodate revelations that had been building for 16 years of patient waiting. Medea watched from her position near the serving tables, with the attentive stillness of someone observing natural phenomena whose significance would only become clear in retrospect, her fingers unconsciously smoothing the fabric of robes that rustled like autumn leaves settling into their final resting places. The oil lamps seemed to burn brighter as father and son looked at each other across distances that were measured not in arm lengths but in years of separation and dreams deferred. When Theseus removed his sandals to display their distinctive craftsmanship, the leather seemed to glow with its own inner light, as if recognizing the hands that had originally placed them beneath that distant boulder. King Aegeus rose from his couch with movements that suggested someone experiencing the physical manifestation of prayers being answered. his steps carrying him across marble floors that had been polished to mirror brightness by servants, who understood that palace spaces should reflect the dignity of those who walked upon them. The embrace that followed possessed all the gentle inevitability of rivers flowing toward the sea, while around them the palace itself seemed to settle into deeper comfort, as if stones and bronze had been waiting for this moment to achieve their true purpose. The remainder of the evening unfolded with the peaceful satisfaction of puzzles solving themselves. Each shared memory and recognized gesture, adding another piece to patterns that had been incomplete for too many seasons. Medea quietly removed her special preparations from the serving tables, replacing them with honey wine that would sweeten dreams, and encourage the deep sleep that follows days when destiny finally reveals its long-hidden designs. Morning light filtered through palace windows like honey poured through finest silk, illuminating chambers where father and son shared the comfortable silence of those who had found missing pieces of themselves in each other's presence. The city beyond the marble walls awakened with the gentle stirrings of a community, preparing for another day of the routines that had governed Athenian life for generations, though today carried an undercurrent of something different. A tension that moved through streets and marketplaces like a barely perceptible shift in the direction of familiar breezes. King Aegeus moved through his morning duties with the measured pace of someone whose personal joy had been tempered by the weight of obligations that could not be postponed, no matter how much happiness had entered his private chambers. The harbour, where fishing boats normally returned with their silver catches gleaming in nets that sparkled with seawater and morning light, today hosted vessels of a different character entirely. 3 black-sailed ships rode at anchor like sleeping sea creatures, their hulls dark against waters that reflected the sky's uncertain mood between sunshine and the gathering clouds that spoke of weather changes approaching from distant horizons. The crews who tended these vessels moved with the efficient quiet of those performing duties that required precision, but offered little satisfaction, their faces bearing the expressionless masks of people who had learned not to think too deeply about the cargo they were preparing to transport. In courtyards throughout the city, young men and women gathered with their families for farewells that carried the weight of rituals performed too many times before, their embraces lingering with the desperate tenderness of those who understood that some partings might prove permanent. Parents spoke in voices carefully modulated to hide their fears, offering blessings and advice that would have to sustain their children through whatever trials awaited in the distant island kingdom, where King Minos ruled with the absolute authority of one whose power had been blessed by gods, who preferred their justice, served without mercy or delay. The tribute that Athens owed could not be paid in gold or grain, but only in the currency that no city could afford, yet none dared refuse to provide. Theseus observed these preparations with the growing understanding of someone witnessing injustice that had been allowed to continue, simply because no one had possessed sufficient courage or strength to challenge its continuation. The sight of tears being carefully hidden and goodbyes being spoken with forced cheerfulness stirred something within him that had nothing to do with heroic ambition and everything to do with the simple recognition that some situations required intervention regardless of personal risk. When he approached his father with a proposal that would change the nature of this tribute voyage, his words carried the quiet certainty of someone who had discovered his true purpose in the gentle cruelty of watching others suffer what he possessed the power to prevent. The conversation between king and prince unfolded with the careful navigation of those discussing matters where love and duty pulled in different directions, each understanding the other's position while hoping desperately for solutions that would satisfy both heart and responsibility. Outside the palace windows, the black ships waited with the patience of vessels that had carried similar cargo too many times to count, their dark sails furled like wings of great birds that had learned to fly only towards sorrow, never away from it. Across the wine-dark sea that separated Athens from the island kingdom, where ancient powers still walked among mortals with the casual authority of those who had never learned to doubt their divine right to shape the world. According to their private visions, King Minos spent his evenings in pursuits that would have surprised those who knew him only through stories told in distant lands. The royal palace of Crete rose from cliffs like a natural formation that had been refined by master architects whose understanding of beauty encompassed both grandeur and the smaller pleasures that made daily life worth savoring. Its courtyards, designed to capture breezes that carried the mingled scents of olive groves and the herbs that grew wild on hillsides, where shepherds tended flocks under skies that seemed larger and more blue than anywhere else in the known world. The king's private chambers overlooked pastures where sheep moved in patterns that suggested choreography designed by some patient deity who understood that watching peaceful creatures graze possessed a calming effect that no amount of gold or conquered territory could provide. Each evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades that reminded him of his wife's favorite fabrics, Minos would stand at his window and count the white forms that dotted green fields like clouds that had decided to rest on earth rather than continue their endless journey across heavens. The ritual had begun years ago as a practical necessity for tracking the royal flocks, but had evolved into something closer to meditation. A daily practice that helped him transition from the demands of ruling an empire to the gentler rhythms of private life. His counting proceeded with the methodical precision of someone who had discovered that numbers, when properly appreciated, possessed their own form of music that could soothe minds troubled by the complex decisions that ruling required. 130 7 ewes grazed near the olive grove where morning shadows provided relief from afternoon heat, while 43 rams surveyed their domain with the dignified composure of creatures who understood their importance in the cosmic order that governed all living things. The lambs, too numerous and energetic for accurate counting, moved through the flock like dancing spirits, celebrating the simple joy of being young and healthy and surrounded by abundance that seemed to stretch as far as the horizon. The tribute ships that would arrive tomorrow carried cargo that had become as routine as the seasonal migrations of birds or the predictable succession of crops that marked the passage of agricultural years, though Minos sometimes wondered if his satisfaction with these arrangements had more to do with maintaining order than with any sense of justice achieved through their continuation. The Minotaur dwelling in the labyrinth beneath the palace had dietary requirements that these regular deliveries satisfied, though the king preferred to think of the arrangement in terms of administrative efficiency rather than dwelling on details that might disturb the peaceful evenings he spent watching sheep arrange themselves according to their own mysterious preferences for companionship and grazing patterns. When the last sheep had been accounted for and assigned to its proper category in the mental ledgers that Minos maintained with the care of someone whose empire depended upon attention to seemingly insignificant details, the king would retire to chambers where servants had prepared honey wine that encouraged dreams of peaceful meadows where all creatures lived, according to harmonious principles that required no enforcement, because they arose naturally from wisdom rather than fear. In workshops that occupied an entire wing of the Cretan palace, where the scent of wood shavings mingled with the metallic tang of bronze cooling, in carefully prepared molds, Daedalus worked by the steady light of oil lamps that burned with flames, so still they seemed painted rather than alive. The master craftsman moved among his tools with the unhurried precision of someone who had learned that true artistry required patience as much as skill, his hands selecting chisels and measuring devices with the automatic certainty of long practice. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, holding models and prototypes that represented years of experimentation with forms that challenged the boundaries between the possible and the merely imagined, each creation wrapped in soft cloth to protect delicate mechanisms from dust, and the curious fingers of visitors who lacked appreciation for the subtle engineering that made beauty functional. The famous labyrinth that lay beneath the palace had begun as sketches on papyrus sheets that now curled at their edges from age and handling. The original designs so covered with annotations and corrections that they resembled maps of territories that existed only in the realm of mathematical possibility. Daedalus had approached the project with the methodical enthusiasm of someone solving a puzzle that required equal measures of architectural knowledge and philosophical understanding, since creating a structure that could contain something without imprisoning, it demanded innovations that conventional builders had never needed to consider. The passages wound through solid rock according to principles that borrowed from the spiral patterns found in seashells and the recursive geometry that governed the growth of fern fronds, unfurling in forest clearings where sunlight filtered through leaves in ever-changing patterns. Each evening, when the day's construction work had been completed, and the stone masons had retired to quarters where they would rest muscles that had been shaped by years of moving blocks that weighed more than horses, Daedalus would return to his private workspace to refine designs for improvements that occurred to him while watching his creation take shape in the world below. His sketches covered every surface with drawings that showed details invisible to casual observation, ventilation systems that would ensure fresh air circulated through passages that never saw direct sunlight, and drainage channels that would prevent the accumulation of moisture that might make walking surfaces treacherous for inhabitants who moved through the labyrinth according to their own mysterious preferences. The winged prototypes that hung from workshop rafters represented experiments in applied mechanics that had grown from observations of birds whose flight patterns suggested possibilities that conventional wisdom declared impossible for creature, bound to earth by weight and gravity. Feathers gathered from eagles and swans had been arranged according to mathematical principles that governed lift and thrust, while bronze joints allowed for the articulation necessary to transform theoretical designs into mechanisms that might someday carry human passengers through air as naturally as ships carried them across water. When inspiration struck during these quiet hours, Daedalus would sketch modifications with the absorbed concentration of someone whose mind moved easily between the practical requirements of engineering and the limitless possibilities that imagination offered to those patient enough to pursue their visions through countless iterations toward perfection. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as construction crews continued hollowing passages that followed curves calculated to create the maximum amount of exploration space within the minimum area of excavation. But tonight belonged to the peaceful satisfaction of refining designs that existed only on papyrus and in dreams. Beneath the palace floors, where courtiers walked on marble surfaces that had been polished to mirror brightness, passages carved from living rock wound through darkness with the organic curves of underground rivers that had learned patience from centuries of moving water through stone. The labyrinth breathed with air that circulated through carefully designed channels, creating gentle currents that carried the faint scent of olive oil from lamps, placed at intervals calculated to provide just enough illumination for safe passage, without destroying the meditative quality that darkness offered to those who understood its gifts. Workers who had spent months hollowing these corridors moved through them with the confident steps of those who had memorized every turn and variation, their voices echoing softly when they called to each other across distances that sound transformed into something musical and strange. The walls themselves bore the subtle marks of master stone carvers, whose chisels had followed natural grain patterns in the rock, creating surfaces that felt smooth as silk beneath questing fingertips, while maintaining enough texture to provide secure handholds for anyone who preferred to navigate by touch rather than sight. Each passage connected to others, according to mathematical principles that ensured no path led to dead ends, though some routes required considerable patience to complete, and others offered shortcuts that revealed themselves only to those who had learned to read the subtle signs that Daedalus had incorporated into his design. The overall effect created a space that felt more like a natural cave system that had been refined by time and weather than a human construction imposed upon resistant materials. Small chambers opened at irregular intervals along the main passages, each designed to serve specific purposes that reflected the architect's understanding of how inhabited spaces should accommodate both practical needs and psychological comfort. Some contained pools fed by underground springs that bubbled up through carefully drilled channels, their water remaining crystal clear and pleasantly cool throughout the warmest months, when surface temperatures made the underground passages feel like refuges from the intensity of Mediterranean sunshine. Others held collections of pottery vessels that could store provisions, while the largest chamber at the labyrinth's heart had been carved with particular attention to acoustics that would allow even whispered conversations to be heard clearly from any position within its boundaries. The lighting system that illuminated these underground pathways represented innovations in engineering that balanced practical necessity with aesthetic consideration, since oil lamps needed to burn steadily without creating smoke that would make breathing uncomfortable, or soot that would blacken walls that had been carved with such care. Bronze mirrors positioned at strategic angles reflected and multiplied the available light, creating pools of illumination that seemed to glow with their own inner radiance, while leaving other areas in shadow that provided visual rest for eyes that might otherwise become strained by constant brightness. The overall effect transformed navigation through the labyrinth into something closer to a walking meditation than a test of problem-solving ability. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps echoed with the slow rhythm of someone who moved through these passages, not as a prisoner exploring a cage, but as a resident who had learned to appreciate the peace that came from living in spaces designed to encourage contemplation, and the kind of deep thinking that required freedom from external distractions. The labyrinth had become exactly what its creator intended, a place where time moved differently and thoughts could follow their own natural patterns without interference from the urgent demands that characterized life in the busy world above ground. In the heart of the labyrinth, where passages converged like streams flowing toward a peaceful lake, the creature that palace inhabitants call the Minotaur had arranged his living space with the careful attention to comfort that someone might devote to a beloved garden or workshop, where important work required both concentration and serenity. Soft cushions stuffed with wool from the sheep that grazed in King Minos' hillside pastures created seating areas where afternoon light filtered down through ventilation shafts that Daedalus had positioned to capture the warmest rays, without allowing rain or wind to disturb the chamber's carefully maintained atmosphere. The walls, worn smooth by countless years of gentle contact, reflected this light in ways that created an ever-changing pattern of brightness and shadow that shifted with the sun's movement across the world above. The Minotaur himself possessed a character that would have surprised those who knew him only through stories told by people who had never ventured into the depths where he made his home among collections of objects that reflected interests developed over years of quiet contemplation. Clay tablets covered with symbols that he had taught himself to carve lay stacked in neat piles beside samples of different types of stone that had caught his attention during explorations of passages that continued to reveal new details even after seasons of familiarity. His massive hands, which storytellers described as instruments of destruction, moved with surprising delicacy when he examined these treasures, turning each piece to catch light that revealed hidden patterns in crystal formations, or the fossilized remains of creatures that had lived in ancient seas. The daily routine that governed his life had evolved according to rhythms that honored both the practical requirements of existence and the psychological need for structure that helped transform solitary living from isolation into a form of peaceful retreat. Morning hours were devoted to exercises that kept his considerable strength from diminishing through lack of use. Movements that resembled dance more than training as he moved through sequences that had been developed to work every muscle while maintaining the flowing grace that came naturally to one whose body had been designed according to principles that conventional anatomy could not explain. These exercises concluded with periods of meditation, during which he sat perfectly still while listening to sounds that drifted down from the world above, identifying different activities by their acoustic signatures and feeling connected to community life without needing to participate directly. Afternoon brought the luxury of rest in chambers where temperature remained constant regardless of seasonal changes that affected surface dwellers, and where the only sounds came from water moving through hidden channels and his own breathing, settling into the deep rhythms that accompanied genuine relaxation. The cushions that supported his considerable bulk had been arranged to accommodate anatomy that differed significantly from human proportions, though the basic requirements for comfort remained surprisingly similar. Dreams that visited during these peaceful hours often featured memories of sunshine and open fields, where flowers released their perfume into breezes that carried no hint of stone or enclosed spaces, though these visions brought contentment rather than longing for experiences that lay beyond his current circumstances. When evening approached and oil lamps throughout the labyrinth began casting their warm glow across surfaces that had absorbed heat during daylight hours, the Minotaur would wake refreshed and ready for activities that filled the quiet hours before sleep returned to claim him for another cycle of rest and restoration. His contentment with this arrangement had grown over years of discovering that solitude, properly embraced, offered gifts that crowded situations could never provide. In palace chambers, where afternoon light filtered through windows, designed to frame views of gardens, where peacocks wandered among flowering shrubs with the unhurried dignity of living jewels, Princess Ariadne worked at her loom with the meditative concentration of someone who had discovered that creating beauty required equal measures of patience and vision. The thread that moved between her fingers possessed a golden quality that seemed to capture sunlight and hold it within its twisted fibers. Each strand spun from wool that had been gathered from sheep, whose fleeces carried the particular luminosity that came from grazing in meadows blessed by soil that had been enriched by centuries of careful tending. Her movements followed rhythms that had been passed down through generations of women whose understanding of textile arts encompassed both practical necessity and the deeper satisfaction that came from transforming raw materials into objects that served purposes beyond mere utility. The tapestries that adorned her chambers depicted scenes from stories that had shaped her understanding of courage and compassion, their threads arranged in patterns that revealed new details each time light struck them from different angles throughout the day's progression, from dawn to dusk. Heroes moved through landscapes that seemed to breathe with their own life, their adventures unfolding in sequences that emphasized wisdom over strength and understanding over conquest. When visitors admired these works, Ariadne would explain the techniques involved with the patient enthusiasm of someone who appreciated questions that allowed her to share knowledge about crafts that required years to master properly. The golden thread that had occupied her attention for recent weeks possessed qualities that distinguished it from conventional materials, its creation having required innovations in spinning that challenged traditional methods while producing results that exceeded her highest expectations. Each strand had been twisted according to specifications that balanced strength with flexibility, creating thread that could bear considerable weight without sacrificing the delicate appearance that made it suitable for decorative work. The process of creating sufficient quantity for her current project had consumed months of careful labor, though the work itself provided the kind of satisfaction that came from pursuing perfection, through patient attention to details that less dedicated craftspeople might consider insignificant. Her window overlooked courtyards, where servants moved with quiet efficiency as they prepared the palace for receiving visitors whose arrival had been anticipated for days, their activities creating a gentle bustle that spoke of hospitality offered with genuine warmth rather than mere obligation. The sight of black-sailed ships riding at anchor in the harbour below stirred something within her that had nothing to do with royal duty and everything to do with the recognition that approaching events would require responses that conventional protocol had never needed to address. Her fingers continued their automatic movements as thread accumulated on the spindle beside her loom, each arm's length representing hours of work that would soon serve purposes she could not yet fully envision. The golden thread gleamed in late afternoon light that painted everything with the warm glow of honey poured through crystal, its coils growing steadily as Ariadne worked with the peaceful concentration of someone who understood that preparation for unknown challenges required attention to details that might prove crucial when circumstances demanded quick thinking and careful planning. Outside her window, the first evening stars appeared in skies that deepened from blue to purple like silk, dyed in celestial workshops, while inside her chamber, the thread continued accumulating with the patient persistence of someone weaving solutions to problems that had not yet revealed their true dimensions. The tribute ships had docked with the gentle precision of vessels guided by experienced captains who understood that even routine arrivals deserved the courtesy of seamanship that honored both cargo and destination. Their black sails furled like sleeping wings against masts that rose toward evening skies, where the first stars appeared with the punctuality of faithful servants, lighting lamps throughout celestial chambers. Theseus stood among his fellow passengers with the composed bearing of someone who had learned to find peace within circumstances that others might consider challenging. His attention focused on details that revealed character in both captors and companions, rather than dwelling on uncertainties that lay beyond the reach of current knowledge. The Cretan harbour bustled with activities that spoke of prosperity and careful organization, though the efficiency with which tribute procedures were conducted suggested practices that had been refined through repetition rather than enthusiasm. Princess Ariadne moved through the welcoming ceremonies with grace that transformed official obligations into gestures of genuine hospitality, her presence lending warmth to protocols that might otherwise have felt merely administrative in their execution. When her eyes met those of the young Athenian prince, something passed between them that had nothing to do with political arrangements and everything to do with the recognition that occasionally occurs when compatible spirits discover each other across distances, measured in more than physical space. Their conversation began with the conventional exchanges required by diplomatic courtesy, though the rhythm of question and answer soon acquired the natural flow of dialogue between people who found each other's thoughts worthy of careful attention. The palace gardens where they walked provided settings that encouraged the kind of unhurried discussion that allowed ideas to develop naturally, rather than being forced toward premature conclusions. Pathways winding among fountains whose gentle murmur created background music that made even silence feel comfortable. Ariadne spoke of her daily routines with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone describing work that brought deep satisfaction, while Theseus shared observations about his journey that revealed perspectives shaped by experiences that conventional royal education could never provide. Their steps synchronized without conscious effort as they moved through spaces designed to accommodate the peaceful contemplation that important conversations required. When their discussion turned toward the challenges that awaited beneath the palace floors, both participants approached the subject with the careful consideration of people who understood that some problems required solutions that conventional wisdom had never needed to address. Ariadne's knowledge of the labyrinth's design came from conversations with Daedalus during construction phases when the architect had shared technical details with someone whose questions demonstrated genuine interest in understanding how spaces could be shaped to serve specific purposes. Her insights into the character of the labyrinth's most famous resident reflected years of indirect contact through gifts of food and small comforts that had been delivered with the consistency of someone who understood that kindness, properly offered, could bridge gaps that seemed impossible to cross. The golden thread that Ariadne had been preparing acquired new significance as their conversation revealed possibilities that neither had considered while working alone, its strength and length representing exactly the kind of innovation that complex problems sometimes required from those patient enough to prepare solutions before knowing precisely how they would be applied. Their planning proceeded with the methodical thoroughness of people who understood that success often depended upon attention to details that seemed insignificant until circumstances revealed their crucial importance. While around them the garden settled into the peaceful quiet that comes when day transitions toward the restful darkness of night. The entrance to the labyrinth opened like a doorway into dreams, its threshold marked by bronze fittings that gleamed with the warm patina of metal that had been polished by countless hands and blessed by time into the kind of beauty that could only emerge from patient use rather than urgent creation. Torches arranged at careful intervals cast pools of golden light that created a progression from the bright world above into depths where illumination became more precious, and shadows acquired the comfortable familiarity of old friends who could be trusted to keep secrets. Theseus descended stone steps that had been carved with attention to both safety and the acoustic properties that would allow footsteps to echo in ways that created music rather than merely noise. His movements acquiring the measured pace of someone entering sacred space that demanded reverence rather than haste. The golden thread that connected him to the world above unspooled with the steady rhythm of something that had been designed to serve exactly this purpose, its weight in his hand providing reassurance that paths forward always implied routes back to familiar territory when exploration had achieved its intended goals. Ariadne remained at the threshold, like a lighthouse keeper tending flames that would guide travelers safely home, her presence at the entrance creating an anchor point that transformed ascent into adventure rather than exile. The thread itself seemed to glow with its own inner light as it passed through passages where conventional illumination created patterns of brightness and shadow that shifted like living things responding to movement and breath. Each turn in the passage revealed new aspects of Daedalus's architectural genius. Walls that curved according to mathematical principles, borrowed from spiral shells and flower petals, their surfaces worn smooth by air currents that had been flowing through these spaces for years, according to ventilation designs that maintained perfect temperature and humidity throughout the seasons. The sound of Theseus's sandals against stone created rhythms that harmonized with the gentle movement of air through hidden channels, while somewhere in the distance water moved through carefully designed channels that provided both practical drainage and the psychological comfort that comes from hearing familiar sounds in unfamiliar places. The labyrinth breathed around him with the peaceful respiration of something alive yet benevolent, its passages offering choices at regular intervals that invited exploration rather than demanding specific decisions. Direction became less important than attention to details that revealed themselves to those who moved with patience rather than urgency. Patterns in the stone that told stories about the craftspeople who had shaped these spaces and the vision that had guided their work toward completion. The oil lamps that marked important intersections burned with flames so steady they seemed painted rather than alive, their light reflecting from bronze mirrors positioned to create illumination that felt natural despite being entirely artificial. Somewhere ahead, the sound of slow breathing suggested presence rather than threat, the kind of deep respiration that comes from someone engaged in peaceful rest rather than watchful waiting. The thread continued unwinding behind him like a golden river flowing uphill toward distant daylight, while each step forward carried him deeper into spaces where time moved according to different principles, and problems that seemed impossible in the bright world above might discover solutions that had been waiting patiently in comfortable darkness for someone brave enough to seek them through paths that wound like meditation toward their inevitable and gentle conclusion. In the heart of the labyrinth, where passages converged like streams flowing toward a mountain lake, the creature that storytellers called the Minotaur stirred from dreams that had been filled with memories of sunshine warming stone surfaces, and the distant sound of sheep bells creating music that drifted across hillsides painted green with spring grass. His awakening proceeded with the unhurried grace of someone whose rest had been both deep and genuinely restorative. Massive limbs stretching according to routines that had been developed over years of solitary living to maintain both physical health and the mental clarity that came from honoring the body's needs for movement and circulation. The sound of approaching footsteps registered in his consciousness, not as alarm, but as curiosity about this unusual variation in the daily patterns that had governed his existence for longer than he sometimes cared to remember. Rising from cushions that had been arranged to accommodate anatomy that differed significantly from conventional human proportions, the Minotaur moved through his living space with steps that demonstrated how thoroughly he had adapted to navigation in chambers where ceiling height and passage width had been calculated to provide comfort for someone whose physical dimensions challenged architectural assumptions. His morning routine included activities that would have surprised those who knew him only through tales told by people who had never ventured into the depths where he made his home among collections of interesting objects and the peaceful sounds of water moving through hidden channels, according to engineering principles that transformed necessity into something approaching music. The clay tablets where he recorded observations about geological formations and the changing patterns of light that filtered down through ventilation shafts lay scattered around seating areas like the research materials of a scholar whose studies had been interrupted by the need for rest. His massive hands moved among these treasures with the delicate precision of someone who understood that knowledge once gained required careful preservation and organization if it were to serve purposes beyond mere personal satisfaction. The symbols that he had developed for recording his thoughts possessed the flowing beauty of writing systems that had evolved naturally rather than being imposed. According to external requirements, each character shaped by fingers that had learned to balance strength with the gentle touch necessary for working with fragile material. When the sound of footsteps grew close enough to suggest that his visitor had successfully navigated the passages that connected his chambers to the labyrinth's entrance, the Minotaur arranged himself in a position that would appear welcoming rather than threatening. His understanding of social interaction, having been shaped by years of reflection on the principles that governed peaceful coexistence between different types of creatures. The light that filtered down from above caught the surfaces of pottery vessels and polished stones in ways that created an atmosphere more suited to scholarly discussion than confrontation, while the gentle movement of air through carefully designed channels carried scents that spoke of growing things and clean water, rather than the mustiness that conventional wisdom associated with underground spaces. His breathing maintained the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to find contentment in circumstances that others might consider challenging. though the approaching encounter represented a variation in routine that stirred something within him that had been dormant for seasons beyond counting. A curiosity about contact with minds that had been shaped by experiences in the bright world above ground, where different rules governed daily existence. The chamber where their meeting unfolded possessed acoustics that transformed even whispered words into something approaching song, while bronze mirrors positioned according to principles that balanced practical illumination with aesthetic beauty created patterns of light that shifted like living things responding to movement and breath. Theseus entered this space with steps that had been slowed by wonder at architectural details that revealed themselves through careful observation. His attention caught by evidence of habitation that spoke of intelligence and creativity rather than the savage isolation that stories had led him to expect. The Minotaur regarded his visitor with eyes that held the patient curiosity of someone accustomed to learning about the world through observation and reflection rather than direct interaction. His massive form arranged in a posture that suggested welcome rather than challenge. Their initial exchange proceeded without words, conducted instead through the ancient language of gesture and expression that predated speech and required no translation between different types of consciousness. Theseus moved with the careful attention of someone exploring a temple where unfamiliar rituals demanded respect, while the Minotaur responded with movements that demonstrated both his considerable strength and the gentle control that years of solitary life had taught him to maintain over physical responses that might otherwise overwhelm smaller creatures. The golden thread that connected the young hero to the world above caught light in ways that created patterns against stone walls, its presence serving as reminder that some journeys were meant to lead home rather than toward permanent exile. The conversation that developed between them transcended conventional boundaries between different forms of life, each participant contributing understanding that had been shaped by experiences unique to their particular circumstances, yet somehow compatible in ways that surprised both parties. The Minotaur shared knowledge about underground water systems and the migration patterns of creatures that lived in darkness, while Theseus described sunlight falling across olive groves and the sound of waves against shores where fishing boats returned with their evening catch. Their exchange possessed the quality of scholars comparing research findings, though the subjects under discussion included topics that no conventional education would have thought to address. The chamber itself seemed to participate in their dialogue, echoes creating harmonies that transformed spoken words into something approaching music, while reflections from polished surfaces multiplied their movements into choreography that neither had consciously planned yet both found natural to perform. Time moved according to different principles in this space, where external pressures held no authority, allowing ideas to develop through the kind of patient exploration that required freedom from urgency and the pressure to reach predetermined conclusions. The clay tablets that recorded the Minotaur's observations became subjects for discussion that revealed common interests in understanding how the world functioned according to principles that remained hidden from casual observation. When their conversation eventually turned toward the question of what conventional wisdom expected from their encounter, both participants approached the subject with the thoughtful consideration of people who understood that some expectations deserved challenge rather than automatic fulfillment. The solutions they developed together emerged naturally from mutual respect, and the recognition that problems often dissolved when examined by minds that had learned to think beyond the limitations imposed by traditional assumptions about what was possible between creatures whose differences seemed to preclude cooperation, but whose similarities ran deeper than surface answers might suggest. The journey back through passages that had become familiar during the hours spent in deep conversation proceeded with the comfortable pace of friends walking together through gardens where every turn revealed new details worthy of appreciation. though now the path served a different purpose than mere exploration. The golden thread that had guided Theseus into the labyrinth's heart now provided a route toward resolution that honored both the expectations of those who waited above and the understanding that had developed between minds that had discovered unexpected compatibility across differences that storytellers had declared impossible to bridge. The Minotaur moved through his domain with steps that demonstrated intimate knowledge of every curve and variation, his presence transforming what might have been a solitary return journey into companionship that made distance seem less significant than the quality of attention paid to details that revealed themselves to patient observation. Their conversation continued as they walked, touching on subjects that ranged from practical concerns about water management in underground spaces to philosophical questions about the nature of freedom and the various forms that imprisonment could take when circumstances required adaptation to limitations that others had imposed without consideration for the preferences of those who would be most affected by such arrangements. The clay tablets that the Minotaur carried contained symbols that represented ideas developed during years of reflection, their weight distributed among the folds of a cloak that Theseus had arranged according to principles that balanced practical necessity with respect for materials that represented considerable time and effort in their creation. The passages themselves seemed different during their acoustics modified by the presence of two voices engaged in dialogue that created harmonies previously unknown in spaces that had witnessed only solitary footsteps and the occasional echo of maintenance work performed by craftspeople who understood their duties without requiring detailed explanation. Bronze mirrors reflected their movements in ways that multiplied their presence throughout chambers that had been designed to accommodate solitary contemplation, but proved equally suitable for conversations that required freedom from external interruption and the pressure to reach conclusions according to schedules imposed by others. When they reached junctions where passages offered multiple routes toward the surface, their choices reflected understanding that had developed through careful discussion of alternatives that conventional thinking had never considered, solutions that emerged from recognizing that some problems required innovation rather than adherence to methods that had been developed for entirely different circumstances. The thread that connected them to the world above had become more than mere guidance system, its golden length representing connections that transcended physical necessity and approached the territory where friendship develops between minds that have learned to appreciate each other's unique perspectives on challenges that require cooperation rather than competition. The sound of voices calling from chambers near the labyrinth's entrance created anticipation that mixed excitement with the gentle melancholy that accompanies the conclusion of experiences that have exceeded expectations in ways that could not have been predicted before they began. Above them, starlight filtered down through ventilation shafts that had been positioned to provide glimpses of the celestial patterns that governed seasons and navigation, while behind them the deeper chambers settled into the peaceful quiet that comes when spaces that have witnessed important conversations prepare to hold those memories until future visitors arrive seeking their own forms of understanding. The harbour of Crete breathed with the gentle rhythm of tides that had been washing these shores, since long before human settlements had transformed natural coves into ports designed to accommodate vessels from distant lands, while moonlight painted the water in shades of silver that made even the tribute ships appear beautiful, despite their somber purpose. Theseus stood among his fellow Athenians with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had solved problems through methods that conventional wisdom had never thought to attempt, his presence among them creating questions that would require careful explanation once their vessel had carried them beyond the reach of Cretan hospitality. The other young people moved with the subdued energy of those who had expected different outcomes from their journey. Their relief at discovering survival where they had anticipated tragedy, tempered by confusion about circumstances that defied everything their education had taught them to expect. Princess Ariadne appeared at the harbour, with steps that carried the flowing grace of someone whose thoughts had been occupied by considerations that extended far beyond the immediate requirements of seeing guests safely aboard ships that would carry them home to families who had spent days in prayer for their safe return. The golden thread that had served its purpose so perfectly lay coiled in her hands like captured sunlight, its length representing hours of preparation that had proven exactly adequate for needs that could not have been calculated in advance. When she spoke with Theseus about arrangements that would ensure the Minotaur's continued being in chambers that had become home rather than prison, her voice carried the practical concern of someone discussing the care of a beloved friend who required specific conditions to maintain both physical health and intellectual satisfaction. The loading of supplies proceeded with efficiency that spoke of planning that had considered possibilities beyond conventional expectations. Crates containing scrolls and writing materials that would allow continued correspondence between minds that had discovered compatibility across differences that geography would now impose between them. The Minotaur had contributed messages intended for scholars in Athens, whose research might benefit from observations made by someone whose unique circumstances had provided perspectives unavailable to conventional academic inquiry, while Daedalus had included mechanical drawings that illustrated innovations developed during construction of underground spaces that had exceeded their original specifications in ways that suggested applications for future building projects. The tide that would carry them away from Crete moved according to rhythms that honored both departure and the connections that would persist across distances, measured in more than mere geographic units. Water that had witnessed countless farewells, creating currents that seemed designed to ease transitions between present circumstances and future possibilities. Captain and crew worked with the practiced efficiency of those who understood that successful voyages required attention to details that landlubbers might consider insignificant, while passengers settled into routines that would govern their lives during days at sea, where time moved according to different principles than those that structured existence on solid ground. The black sails that had carried them to Crete filled with evening breezes that promised steady progress toward home waters, where families waited with the patient hope of those who had learned to trust in outcomes that surpassed their ability to influence through anything other than faith in forces larger than individual will, while behind them the lights of Cretan palaces faded into distance that transformed specific memories into impressions that would grow more precious with each passing season. The island of Naxos rose from waters that sparkled like scattered diamonds in morning sunlight, its shores offering harbours where vessels could rest while crews refreshed themselves with spring water that bubbled up from sources that had been providing sweet relief to travellers since the earliest days of navigation among islands that dotted the Aegean. Like stepping stones placed by gods who understood that journeys required opportunities for contemplation as much as progress toward distant destinations. Princess Ariadne walked along beaches where waves deposited shells and smooth stones that caught light in ways that reminded her of the golden thread that had served its purpose so perfectly in chambers far beneath Cretan palaces, her steps creating patterns in sand that would be erased by the next tide, yet somehow felt significant in the moment of their creation. The decision to remain on Naxos had emerged naturally from conversations during their sea voyage, discussions that revealed how thoroughly her perspectives had been changed by experiences that challenged assumptions she had carried since childhood about duty and happiness, and the various forms that fulfillment could take when circumstances offered choices that had not previously seemed possible. The island itself provided everything necessary for someone whose needs had been simplified by recognition that true contentment came from aligning daily activities with values that had been clarified through encounters with minds whose wisdom transcended conventional boundaries between different types of consciousness and understanding. The cave, where she made her temporary home, opened onto gardens where wild herbs grew, according to patterns that suggested cultivation, by someone who understood that beauty and utility could be combined through approaches that honored both aesthetic preferences and practical requirements. Morning brought activities that filled hours with the kind of satisfaction that came from working directly with materials that responded to patient attention, while afternoons offered opportunities for the contemplation that had become essential to her sense of well-being, since discovering how much could be learned through careful observation of details that revealed themselves only to those who approached the world with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined expectations. The scrolls that Theseus had left contained questions about textile techniques and engineering principles that connected her daily experience to larger patterns of knowledge that scholars in distant cities were exploring through methods that differed from hers in approach, yet aimed towards similar goals of understanding how the world functioned according to principles that could be discovered. Through careful investigation, her responses took the form of detailed drawings that illustrated innovations she had developed during months of solitary experimentation, each sketch accompanied by notes that explained not only the practical applications of specific techniques, but also the philosophical considerations that had guided her thinking toward solutions that honored both tradition and innovation. The evening hours, when she walked along shores where wavelets deposited treasures from deep water, brought the kind of peace that came from living according to rhythms that felt natural rather than imposed, her breathing synchronizing with the eternal conversation between sea and land that had been continuing since long before human voices had joined the ancient chorus of sounds that filled spaces between sky and earth. Above her, stars appeared with the punctuality of old friends, arriving for familiar gatherings, their light reflecting from water surfaces that captured and multiplied celestial beauty into patterns that changed constantly, yet somehow remained eternally the same, while around her the island settled into the comfortable quiet that comes when day transitions toward the restorative darkness that prepares all living things for dreams that carry wisdom forward into tomorrow's possibilities. The god who wandered among islands with the unhurried pace of someone whose existence transcended the temporal boundaries that governed mortal concerns, had learned to appreciate discoveries that presented themselves without fanfare, treasures that revealed their true value only to those who possessed sufficient patience to observe carefully rather than rushing toward predetermined destinations. Morning mist rising from waters that had been warmed by yesterday's sunshine created veils that transformed familiar landscapes into something approaching dreams made visible, while Dionysus moved through these ethereal curtains with steps that disturbed neither dewdrops on flower petals nor the delicate spider webs that connected reed stalks, in patterns that suggested music written in silver thread and morning light. The figure sleeping peacefully on shores where waves deposited offerings from deep water caught his attention, not through any dramatic gesture, but simply through the quality of serenity that surrounded her, like an invisible aura that spoke of someone who had achieved the kind of inner peace that gods recognized as rare among mortals whose lives were typically consumed by anxieties about circumstances beyond their control. Princess Ariadne rested with the complete relaxation that came from exhaustion that had been earned through days of genuine accomplishment, her breathing synchronized with the rhythm of wavelets against sand in ways that suggested someone who had learned to align personal rhythms with the larger patterns that governed natural phenomena. The consideration that Dionysus gave to this unexpected encounter reflected his understanding that some moments required approaches that honored both divine nature and mortal sensibility, recognition that power exercised without wisdom often destroyed exactly what it intended to preserve or enhance. His presence created subtle changes in the immediate environment that enhanced rather than disrupted the peaceful atmosphere. Morning glory vines blooming with unusual abundance, while fruit trees that had been struggling in sandy soil suddenly found the strength to produce offerings that would sustain someone whose circumstances required self-sufficiency rather than dependence upon conventional sources of support. The conversation that developed between divine consciousness and mortal intelligence proceeded through methods that transcended ordinary speech, understanding that flowed directly between minds that had both learned to appreciate beauty in forms that conventional wisdom often overlooked or dismissed as insignificant details unworthy of serious attention. Ariadne's experiences with threads that could guide travelers through impossible passages and conversations with creatures that existed beyond normal categories of classification had prepared her for encounters that required flexibility rather than rigid adherence to expectations, based on limited previous experience with phenomena that defied conventional categorization. When morning mist finally dissolved under sunshine that painted everything in shades of gold and amber, the arrangements that had been established between them reflected mutual recognition that some partnerships developed naturally from compatible purposes rather than external obligations or dramatic declarations that attempted to impose significance upon relationships that derived their true meaning from daily interactions based on respect and shared appreciation for possibilities that neither participant could have achieved alone. The island itself seemed to approve of these developments. Morning breezes carrying scents that spoke of gardens where unusual plants thrived under conditions that combined divine blessing with mortal wisdom applied to practical challenges that required both innovation and patience in their resolution. The tribute ship glided across waters that reflected morning light like hammered silver, its black sails filled with breezes that carried the vessel homeward with the steady progress of something moving, according to natural law rather than human urgency, while dolphins played in the wake that spread behind them like liquid wings extending from their wooden hull toward horizons that promised familiar shores and reunions that had been anticipated since the day of their departure from Athens. Theseus stood at the vessel's prow with the peaceful satisfaction of someone whose journey had exceeded expectations in ways that would require considerable time to understand fully. His thoughts drifting like morning mist as he watched islands pass in stately procession, each landfall offering glimpses of coastlines where other stories were unfolding according to their own mysterious purposes. The scrolls that Princess Ariadne had entrusted to his care rested in waterproof containers that had been crafted by Cretan artisans, whose understanding of preservation techniques ensured that knowledge could survive the hazards of sea travel, their contents representing innovations in engineering and textile arts that would benefit scholars whose research required access to information that could only be gained through approaches that conventional wisdom had never thought to attempt. The correspondence that had been established between the Minotaur and philosophers in Athens promised exchanges that would enrich understanding on both sides of waters that separated different forms of intelligence yet could not prevent the flow of ideas between minds that had discovered compatibility across differences that geography imposed but could not make insurmountable. The young Athenians who shared the vessel's deck moved with the relaxed posture of people whose fears had been replaced by experiences that challenged everything their education had taught them to expect from encounters with creatures and circumstances that existed beyond the boundaries of familiar territory, their conversations creating gentle murmur that blended with the sound of water, moving past bronze fittings that had been polished to gleaming perfection by sailors who understood that attention to detail distinguished professional seamanship from mere transportation between distant ports. Their relief at discovering survival where they had anticipated tragedy had evolved into something approaching wisdom about the unreliability of assumptions based on stories told by people whose knowledge came from rumor rather than direct experience. The captain who guided their vessel homeward possessed the steady competence of someone whose life had been spent reading signs that others never noticed, wind patterns and wave formations that revealed information about weather conditions and navigational challenges that lay ahead of ships whose safety depended upon decisions made by people who understood that successful voyages required both technical skill and the kind of intuitive understanding that could only be developed through years of patient observation. His quiet confidence created atmosphere that encouraged rest among passengers whose recent experiences had been exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with the mental adjustments required when reality proved more complex than expectation had suggested. The afternoon sun painted their sails with light that transformed black fabric into something approaching deep purple, while around them the sea stretched in all directions like silk sheets that had been smoothed by invisible hands whose touch left no trace, except the gentle undulation that rocked their vessel with the soothing rhythm of a crass. Daedalus designed to encourage the kind of deep rest that prepares travelers for arrivals that will require them to translate extraordinary experiences into language that can be understood by those who remained safely at home. The highest tower of the Athenian palace provided views that stretched across waters, where morning light created pathways of gold leading toward distant islands that seemed to float like dreams, half remembered from peaceful sleep, while King Aegeus maintained his patient vigil with the steady devotion of someone whose hope had been seasoned by enough experience to understand that the most important arrivals often came disguised as ordinary moments that revealed their significance only in retrospect. The marble beneath his hands had been worn smooth by countless hours of waiting that had transformed anxiety into something approaching meditation, his fingers tracing patterns in stone, while his eyes searched horizons where sky met water in lines, so subtle they seemed drawn by artists who understood that beauty often resided in transitions too gentle to be grasped by urgent attention. Servants moved through the tower chambers with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to provide comfort without intruding upon the kind of solitude that some forms of waiting required, their activities creating gentle background sounds that spoke of daily life continuing according to rhythms that honored both routine and the possibility that this day might bring changes that would transform familiar patterns into memories of times when the future remained uncertain. The oil lamps that would be lit when evening came rested in alcoves that had been carved to frame views of harbour waters where fishing boats created moving patterns against backgrounds that shifted from blue to silver to gold as light moved across surfaces that had been reflecting such changes since long before human eyes had learned to appreciate their beauty. The meals that were brought to sustain him during these long hours of observation consisted of foods that could be eaten without requiring attention, that might be diverted from the essential task of watching for sails, that would announce resolution of concerns that had occupied his thoughts since the day black ships had carried precious cargo toward destination, where conventional wisdom suggested that hope and expectation should be replaced by resignation to outcomes that mortal influence could not affect. Honey cakes and wine mixed with water created combinations that nourished both body and spirit, while fruits that had been selected for their ability to sustain concentration provided sweetness that reminded him of afternoons when simpler pleasures had seemed sufficient to fill hours that now stretched like pathways toward horizons, where answers waited with the patience of distant mountains that remained constant despite changes in weather and season. The conversations that he held with advisors who climbed the tower stairs to provide updates about city affairs unfolded with the careful consideration of people who understood that some decisions required information that had not yet become available, their voices creating gentle counterpoint to the eternal sound of wind moving past stone surfaces that had been shaped to capture breezes, while deflecting the kind of harsh weather that might make observation impossible during storms, that transformed familiar landscapes into territories that belonged to forces larger than human planning could anticipate or control. Their reports about harbour conditions and weather patterns contributed to understanding that helped him interpret signs that others might miss, subtle changes in wave formation and bird behaviour that revealed information about distant conditions that affected the progress of vessels whose location could only be estimated through calculations that balanced hope with practical knowledge about the realities of navigation across waters that could be both generous and treacherous. The evening light that would soon transform the sea into a mirror that reflected stars created anticipation that mixed excitement with the kind of deep calm that comes from understanding that some forms of patience prepare the heart to receive gifts that exceed the capacity of imagination to predict their specific form or timing. While below him the city settled into routines that had been established to honor both ordinary life and the extraordinary moments when destiny revealed plans that had been developing in silence toward manifestations that would justify faith in possibilities that reason alone could never guarantee. The tribute ship approached familiar waters with the steady progress of something carried by currents that had been flowing toward home since the moment of departure. Though the excitement of approaching reunion had created an atmosphere aboard the vessel that transformed routine sailing procedures into celebrations that began before actual arrival could justify such expressions of relief and joy. Theseus stood among companions whose faces reflected emotions that ranged from pure happiness to the complex mixture of gratitude and bewilderment that comes from discovering survival where death had seemed inevitable. Their voices creating cheerful conversation that carried across water toward shores, where families waited with the kind of hope that had been refined by experience into something stronger than mere optimism, yet more flexible than rigid expectation of specific outcomes. The black sails that had carried them away from Athens filled with evening breezes that promised swift completion of their homeward journey, while crew members worked with efficiency that spoke of eagerness to complete duties that would allow them to join families whose lives had been suspended in the particular form of waiting that seafaring communities understood. As part of their relationship with waters that could separate loved ones for periods that felt endless, until the moment when familiar sails appeared on horizons that had remained empty for too many days. The preparations for docking proceeded according to procedures that had been refined through generations of experience. Though today these routine activities acquired special significance from the knowledge that this arrival would bring news that exceeded the most optimistic predictions that anyone had dared to voice during the anxious days following their departure. The conversations that filled the ship's deck touched on subjects that revealed how thoroughly their experiences had challenged assumptions that had governed their understanding of courage and wisdom and the various forms that victory could take when problems were approached, with methods that conventional thinking had never considered adequate for dealing with challenges that seemed to require dramatic solutions, rather than patient negotiation. Their discussions created gentle murmur that blended with sounds of rigging and hull moving through water in ways that suggested music composed by forces that understood how homecoming should be announced to those whose ears had been trained by longing to detect the specific sounds that meant safety and reunion after periods of separation that tested faith in outcomes that could not be guaranteed through any amount of worry or preparation. The captain who guided their approach to harbour waters possessed knowledge that extended beyond mere technical competence to include understanding of the psychological effects that different approaches could have on both passengers and those who waited on shore. His decisions about speed and angle reflecting consideration for the dramatic impact that arrivals could create when handled with appreciation for the emotions that such moments generated in hearts that had been prepared by hope and fear to respond intensely to signals that confirmed either the fulfillment or disappointment of expectations that had been cultivated through days of careful attention to possibilities that lay beyond the control of human will. In the excitement of approaching harbour, and the conversations that filled every available moment with expressions of relief and anticipation, the black sails that had announced their departure remained unchanged, their dark fabric creating silhouette against evening sky that would be interpreted by watchers on shore according to systems of meaning that had been established to provide immediate information about outcomes that could not wait for verbal confirmation, while the joy that filled the ship created atmosphere so complete that practical considerations about signals and symbols were overlooked in favor of the more immediate pleasure of sharing stories about experiences that had exceeded every prediction about what their journey might accomplish. The harbor of Athens welcomed the returning vessel with waters that sparkled like jewels, scattered by generous hands, while crowds gathered along stone quays with the patient enthusiasm of people whose hopes had been sustained through days of careful attention to horizons that had remained empty, until this moment when familiar sails finally appeared carrying answers to prayers that had been offered with the steady devotion of those who understood that some forms of waiting transformed anxiety into something approaching wisdom. King Aegeus descended from his tower with steps that carried the measured pace of someone whose vigil had prepared him to receive whatever news the approaching ship might bring. His years of experience having taught him that joy and sorrow often arrived wearing similar disguises and required careful examination before their true nature could be understood and appropriately honored. The reunion that unfolded on harbor stones, worn smooth by generations of similar gatherings, possessed the gentle quality of dreams made manifest in waking life. Families embracing children whose return had seemed too wonderful to expect, yet too necessary to abandon, their voices creating chorus that spoke of relief so complete it approached the territory of religious experience. Theseus moved among these celebrations with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose actions had contributed to outcomes that exceeded the most optimistic predictions. Though his attention remained focused on the individual stories of reunion, rather than any broader implications about heroism or destiny that scholars might derive from events that felt more like gifts received than victories achieved through personal effort. The scrolls and clay tablets that had been entrusted to his care found their way into hands that would ensure their contents reached scholars whose research would benefit from access to knowledge that could only have been gained through approaches that conventional wisdom had never thought to attempt, while the correspondence that had been established between distant minds promised exchanges that would enrich understanding in ways that political arrangements could never achieve. The Athenian libraries that received these materials settled them among collections where they would wait patiently for readers whose questions would unlock insights that had been preserved through methods that honored both practical necessity and the deeper satisfaction that came from contributing to knowledge that transcended the boundaries that geography attempted to impose upon the flow of ideas between compatible intelligences. The palace chambers where father and son shared the comfortable silence of those who had found missing pieces of themselves in each other's presence gradually filled with the gentle sounds of evening, settling over a city whose routines had been restored to patterns that honored both ordinary life and the extraordinary moments when destiny revealed plans that had been developing according to principles too subtle for human planning to anticipate or control. Oil lamps cast warm light across surfaces that reflected years of careful maintenance, while somewhere in the distance fountains created music that spoke of waters flowing, according to courses that had been designed to encourage the kind of peaceful contemplation that made even palace life feel more like extended meditation than burden of responsibility. The stories that would be told about their journey spread through Athens with the gentle persistence of morning mist, each retelling adding details that revealed new aspects of experiences that had challenged every assumption about courage and wisdom and the various forms that victory could take when problems were approached with patience rather than force. While throughout the city, people settled into sleep that would be blessed with dreams of possibilities that exceeded the capacity of conventional thinking to imagine, yet somehow felt as natural and inevitable as sunrise following the restful darkness of night. Years had passed like pages turning in books that chronicled the gradual transformation of Athens into a city where wisdom flowed as freely as water from the fountains that graced courtyards designed to encourage the kind of peaceful contemplation that made learning feel more like meditation than mere accumulation of facts. Theseus, now bearing the quiet authority that came from experiences that had shaped his understanding of leadership into something that honored both practical necessity and the deeper satisfactions that arose from serving purposes larger than personal ambition, spent his evenings in chambers where scrolls from distant lands created libraries that testified to connections between minds that geography could separate but never truly divide. The correspondence that continued to arrive from Crete brought news of innovations in architecture and engineering that had emerged from collaborations between the Minotaur's unique perspective on underground spaces and Daedalus's gift for translating theoretical possibilities into practical applications that served real needs in the world above ground. Each letter carried drawings that illustrated improvements in ventilation systems and structural designs that had been developed through methods that combined mathematical precision with intuitive understanding of how spaces could be shaped to encourage both physical comfort and psychological well-being. While the philosophical discussions that accompanied these technical details revealed depths of thought that would have surprised those who knew the labyrinth's former inhabitant only through stories that had never captured the true character of someone whose solitude had been transformed into opportunity for the kind of deep reflection that crowded circumstances rarely permitted. The golden thread that Princess Ariadne had crafted with such care now rested in a place of honor among the palace treasures, though its true value lay not in the precious metals that had been woven into its fibers, but in the memory of how simple materials properly prepared and applied with wisdom could solve problems that had seemed impossible until someone approached them with sufficient patience to discover solutions that had been waiting in the gentle spaces between conventional thinking and innovative possibility. Visitors who admired its craftsmanship often asked about the techniques involved in its creation, questions that led to discussions about the relationship between preparation and opportunity, and how readiness to serve purposes that had not yet revealed themselves often proved more valuable than elaborate plans that attempted to control outcomes that lay beyond the reach of human influence. The harbour where ships arrived with regularity that spoke of trade relationships based on mutual respect, rather than tribute extracted through threats, brought merchants whose goods included not only the usual offerings of pottery and metalwork, but also ideas that had travelled even farther than the physical objects that served as their visible representative. Innovations in agriculture and medicine that had emerged from exchanges between scholars who had learned to appreciate knowledge regardless of its source or the circumstances under which it had been developed. The young people who had once sailed toward Crete as tribute now served as ambassadors whose understanding of different cultures had been shaped by experiences that prepared them to build bridges across differences that conventional diplomacy often treated as insurmountable obstacles. The evening light that painted the palace walls in shades that reminded observers of honey poured through crystal-created atmosphere that encouraged the kind of peaceful reflection that allowed memories to settle into their proper places among the collection of experiences that shaped understanding without overwhelming the present moment with unnecessary weight from past achievements or future possibilities. While throughout the city, citizens prepared for sleep that would be blessed with dreams of wisdom shared across waters, that connected rather than divided the various forms of intelligence that inhabited a world large enough to hold more possibilities than any single mind could encompass, yet small enough that patient effort could create connections between the most unlikely companions. And so our gentle journey through the labyrinthine paths of ancient Greece comes to its peaceful rest, like evening shadows settling over marble courtyards where wisdom had learned to walk hand in hand with kindness. We have wandered together through olive groves where heroes moved with the unhurried pace of afternoon breezes, discovering that the greatest victories often came not from the clash of bronze against bronze, but from the patient art of listening to voices that others had dismissed as impossible to understand. In these drowsy halls, where even minotaurs pursued scholarly interests and princesses wove golden solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable, we have learned that courage sometimes wore the quiet garments of curiosity, and that labyrinths designed to imprison could become sanctuaries for the kind of deep thinking that the bright world above rarely permitted. The thread that guided our hero home was spun not merely from precious metals, but from the understanding that preparation and wisdom, properly combined, could transform the most fearsome challenges into opportunities for connection across differences that only seemed impossible to bridge. As our story settles into the comfortable silence that follows tales well told, let your own thoughts drift like morning mist across waters that connect distant shores, carrying with them the gentle wisdom that some of life's most important journeys lead not to destinations we had planned, but to discoveries that patient hearts were prepared to recognize when they appeared, wearing the simple disguises of ordinary miracles. Close your eyes now, dear listener, and let the warm Mediterranean breeze carry you toward dreams where golden threads lead through passages lit by oil lamps that burn with the steady flame of ancient wisdom. In sleep's own peaceful labyrinth, may you find the kind of rest that refreshes both body and spirit, preparing you for tomorrow's gentle adventures in a world that holds more wonders than daylight thinking can imagine, yet reveals its secrets gladly to those who approach with the patient curiosity of scholars exploring libraries, where every scroll contains stories of connection discovered in the most unexpected places. Sleep well and dream of olive groves where heroes and minotaurs share afternoon conversations about the beauty of spirals found in seashells and the mathematics that governs the growth of morning glory vines, while somewhere in the distance, waves whisper against ancient shores with the eternal rhythm that rocks all living things toward the restorative darkness, where wisdom grows in silence, waiting to bloom like night, flowering jasmine when morning light returns to bless another day of possibilities, as gentle and inevitable as breathing.